Thank you. I'm very honored to be able to introduce Dr. Roberta Modugno, who is giving the Ralph Raico lecture today. I first met Roberta at the Austrian research conference in 1997, but I'd heard of her before that, in that when she became interested in the thought of Murray Rothbard, she wrote to Joey Rothbard's wife, mentioning her interest. And Joey Rothbard had told me about it, and she was very pleased that someone from Italy, from Europe, was interested in her husband's work. And in fact, she has become one of the world's top authorities on Rothbard. She is a professor of the history of political thought at the University of Rome III, and she published in 1988 in Italian the first book on Murray Rothbard in any language, not just in Italian, but in any language. And since that time, she's done two collections of Rothbard's papers, one called Rothbard versus the Philosophers, and this came out, I think, in this I think came out around 2008, and now she has another forthcoming book on Rothbard's papers, and she's also has another book in Italian that has just come out on the thought of Murray Rothbard. She's also done research. She got her degree at the Lewis University, and her doctorate was on the subject of Mary Wollstonecraft and the French Revolution. Her book was the first book on Wollstonecraft political thought published in Italian. So she has a habit of being the first in everything. And she's now going to give us a lecture on the state, which I'm sure I look forward to greatly. I'm sure will be outstanding. So I'd like to present Professor Roberta Modugno.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much. First of all, I want to thank the Mises Institute and for this kind invitation. And I want to thank Professor Joe Salerno and, of course, Professor Tom Di Lorenzo, the president of the Mises Institute. So today I will talk about the making of the state. And to talk about the making of the state, we need to talk about the origin of the state. So what needs to be asked is how have things gone historically? What is the historical origin of the state? A realistic vision of the state must start from the assumption of the historicity of the state. I mean, the state has not always existed. This is something I try to explain to my students, and it is very difficult for them to accept the idea that the state has not always existed. The state has its own place of birth, its own birthplace, and its own date of birth. Its birthplace is continental Europe, and its its date of birth roughly coincides with the beginning of the modern age. There are three major events that mark the entry into the modern age: the fall of Constantinople, that marked the end of the Eastern Roman Empire, the discovery of America, Martin Luther's reformations. And the modern age was a break with the Middle Age, was a break with the Middle Age. And in particular, it was a break with that structure of political power that was not centralized and that dominated European history for almost a millennium, and was a kind of organization of power that was dispersed among multiple centers of power. Multiple centers of power. So the state is modern. The Middle Age and the Ancient Age didn't know state forms, because the political organization of those periods was not even remotely comparable of that of the modern age. So it is therefore to be well aware of what the Italian political scientist Gianfranco Miglio writes. The type of political order in force today, far from being the only and inevitable product of universal reason, is only the result, basically quite occasional, of a series of historical conjunctures. There can certainly be no doubts about the European origin of state institutions. The state was born in Europe and then spread all over the world, because the state lives among its own similars and interact with other states. So the state started from Europe and then spread around the world. So we, from Europe, gave you a wonderful present, the state. So now the theory that situated the origin of the state in modernity is largely accepted, but it developed only during the 20th century. Thanks to a group of scholars in Germany. You can see here the kind of organization of power that characterized Europe during the Middle Age. So was so different from the organization of power of the modern state. You can see so many different and dispersed center of powers, the feuds. Each of one was a center of sovereignty. This is another map, Europe in 1300. So, as I said, the theory that situated the birth of the modern state in modernity is largely accepted, but thanks to a group of scholars in Germany, especially Max Weber, Carl Schmitt, Otto Brunner, and Otto Hintz. But until the beginning of the last century, the term state was a sort of super concept used to indicate any type of organized political community. And we must say that this use of the term has not completely disappeared. Even today, most of the people maybe use the term state in order to indicate any kind of political community. The birth of the state was everywhere, was marked by certain aims. The birth of the state was marked by the attempt of pacification, basically. The first aim was pacification. If we look at the internal problems of territories at the beginning of the modern age, we are faced with the problem of order. And to the problem of concentrating judicial power in the hands of the king, and to the problem of eradicating feudal principalities in order to achieve the territoriality of the state, was added a new modern problem, the wars of religion. So the wars of religion that actually there were civil wars. In France, there was the struggle between Catholic and Huguenots. In the German Empire, during the phase of the 30 Years' War, the conflict between Catholic and Protestant. In England, we found the civil war between Anglicans, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and Independents. And there were also the pressure from international environment. The wars for domination over Italy, the 30 Years' War, the war for Spanish succession, the 7 Years' War. So it was a very difficult period. So in order to establish peace and to protect the people, a state must establish itself as the sole holder of power within a territory and must not tolerate competitors. To be successful, in fact, the state must prohibit the private use of force and credibly present itself as the sole repository of the power to use violence. Max Weber, whose definition of the state is one of the most famous in the history of the social sciences, was among the first to highlight this aspect of modern statehood. And he depicts the emergence of the state in the following way. The spread of pacification and the expansion of the market constitute a development which is accompanied along parallel lines by one, the monopolization of legitimate violence by the political organization, which finds its culmination in the modern concept of the state as the ultimate source of every kind of legitimacy of the use of physical force, and two, that rationalization of the rules of its application, which has come to culminate in the concept of the legitimate legal order. But the state must make its protection an offer that cannot be refused. And to do that, it must do one thing. It must disarm the society. The unilateral offer becomes binding if the population is deprived of weapons. That is to say, if it is unable to defend itself either from private individuals or, of course, from state officials. Otto Brunner, in his classic study, Land and Lordship, of 1939, identified one of the keys to interpreting the emergence of the state in the gradual abolition of the feud of the Germanic population in the Austrian area. And he showed that the legal and political rationalization of modernity implied the disarmament of citizens, followed by the creation of a caste of armed servants of the state. So all the classical functions of the state, starting with the monopoly of legislation, arise from the imposition of disarmament on the whole society. The offense to a citizen becomes an offense to the state interest, which is to preserve order in order to acquire a greater and greater control over the territory. The state represents itself as the only possible synthesis for modernity. We can see the cradle of the state in the Italian system of state after the Peace of Lodi in 1454, but the true cradle of the modern state was 16th century France. It is precisely in the absolute French monarchy that emerged from the religious wars between Catholics and Huguenots that it is possible to observe that bureaucratization and centralization of the exercise of power, which is a fundamental characteristic of the state. The beginning of the state can be placed in the second half of the 16th century. And if the state is a political fact, political are the causes of its development. It is born to give precise answers to precise political problems, to challenges that come from both the international arena and from the territory over which the state wants to exercise its sovereignty. The state has to aim above all at its own survival in an unstable world, where it was perpetually exposed to risk, and to survive meant to enlarge and strengthen its dominance within. The political form of modernity is the principality, which then becomes the modern state. So, to consolidate itself, the principality led a struggle against the remnants of feudalism still present in the modern world. The architects of this new construction were essentially the assistants of the absolute monarchy, who were almost always legists, that is to say, technicians of law. The keystone they devised is the production of law by the prince or by the king, and by the king alone. The king was the only one who could make the law. Then the small nobility who dedicated themselves to administrative and judicial tasks was born, beside the traditional nobility of the sword. The other problem of the modern state concerns the finding of the financial means to implement policies and to sustain the entire machinery of government. In the ancient regime, the Assembly of the Estate in France took the name of States General, and in the view of the champions of the absolute monarchy, it was an obstacle to the full deployment of the king's power and his organizational action. So on the one hand, we have feudalism, which was still opposed in every way to the financial strengthening of the monarchy. And on the other, the monarchy's request for money, at the basis of which modern taxation lies. An important fact to which attention must be drawn is the legal fact. In fact, the judges employed by the king ended up prevailing over the feudal lords who had judicial functions in the feudal system, and the judges, depending from the king, by the king, prevailed over the legal experts as private judges. The king's courts spread to various countries: the Cour de Parlement in France, the King Bench in Great Britain, and the new judges were reporting directly to the king, and they declared justice in the name of the king and in the name of the king alone. The prince is the crucial figure of the modern state. He manages to centralize power with the help of his officials and through a new administrative system, the machinery of the state. As the historian Federico Chabot points out, this machinery is created to the establishment of a series of functions that acquire a character of stability within a territory. First, standing armies that exist even in peacetime and are made up of mercenary soldiers dependent only on the king. Then, stable diplomacy and an ever-growing state bureaucracy. Ever-growing. The state, however, is not separable from its ideological construction. So all modern politics is reformulated with a new language, a modern language, the vocabulary of the state. So on the one hand, it is true that the state is an historical determined concept that marks the period from the era of absolute monarchies to today's democracies. But on the other hand, the state positions itself as the greatest and only possible form of political order. The politics cannot even be thought outside the framework of the state and its paradigm. So the state represents itself as the sole answer to the problem of political order. There cannot be no other answers to the problem of political order, only the state. And this is an ideology, of course. And this construction, the state, that has accompanied us for 5 centuries till now, till today, because we live in states, the state is still with us. So this construction also exercise a conceptual tyranny over us, because it tries to prevent us even from thinking about politics in a different way, outside the framework of the state. It is considered even impossible to think about politics outside the framework of the state. I mean, it is also a kind of discourse typical of a typical libertarian discourse, a typically libertarian attempt trying to think about politics according another way, in a different way, that the problem of order maybe could be solved in other ways, and not only through the state, the machinery of the state. And at this point, we have clearly established the modernity of the state, the historicity of the state, and the fact that the state established itself as the only and possible answer to the problem of political order. And now we can talk about another doctrine typical of the state, typically linked to the state, to the emergence of the state, the reason of the state as a political science. The heart of all novelties introduced by power organized in state form lies in the principle of sovereignty, unique, absolute, indivisible, certain, and perpetual, as defined by Jean Bodin in his 6 books of the Republic, 6 livres de la République. The instrument used by the king is the law, to which he alone is not subject. In fact, in Latin, it was said that the king was legibus solutus, was not bounded by the law. Here we see the modernity of Bodin. The sovereign power is the power to decide for everybody without any kind of restrictions. The sovereign authority is not limited by law or by consent. The term state, roughly as we understand it today, appears in the writings of Niccolò Machiavelli, in particular in The Prince. All the states, all the dominions under whose authority men have lived in the past and live now have been and are either republics or principalities. At this point, the medieval period was definitely over. The political writers of the mid-16th century had to take note of the new institutional situation and the conditions which political life in the Italian peninsula and in the Catholic states actually took place. There were monarchical regimes of ancient origin and well-established principality. So the writers generally took for granted the form that states has assumed in the second half of the 16th century, posing only the question of the best form of government, the best possible regime. These writers, therefore, worked for their princes and for their states, mostly with encomiastic intent, helping to consecrate the model of absolute principality and to fix the professional role of the prince, agents, and advisors, the future bureaucrats. So the new times were characterized by the affirmation of absolute monarchies. The political theories that had begun to respond to the need of political realism, foremost the thought of Machiavelli, began to separate the political sphere from the religious and moral sphere. In fact, affirmation of the principality and of the modern state meant that the society of the Counter-Reformation must confront the objective autonomy and unscrupulousness of politics. So politics had become an autonomous political science, the reason of the state, an autonomous political science, completely separate from religion and from morality, also current morality. There were writers, also Catholic writers, who evinced a political realism or that practical Machiavellianism which was constantly present on the flip side of the Counter-Reformation. The men of action and the counselors of the prince, of the king, gave suggestions with which they showed they believed in the truth of Francesco Guicciardini, who said that political power cannot be yielded according to the dictates of good conscience, and of Cosimo the Elders, that the power of state was not maintained by paternosters. But among the Catholic intellectuals who were able to satisfy the need for realism in the management of states, we find the Italian Giovanni Botero. And he was a Catholic writer. His major work was the reason of the state, and it was published in Venice in 1589. The work referred not to a strictly Italian princely model, but to the dominant state form in Europe in the late 16th century. the absolute monarchical state. Botero mentioned in the treaty The Reason of the State 16th century political literature that had realistically described and discussed the actual policy of state on the level of pure political art, interest, and the maintenance of the state. That is, the reason of the state. Botero defines the reason of the state as follows. Reason of state is knowledge of the means suitable to found, conserve, and expand dominion. Botero intended to rescue the reason of the state from its condition of immoral and unscrupulous political praxis and to elevate it into the objective sphere by giving it the neutral character of political sciences. As Botero puts it, the conservation of a state consists in the peace and quiet of the subject, and the principal purpose for which the people pay tribute and taxes to the prince is that he maintains peace and quiet through the administration of justice. The stability of states depends on the obedience of the subjects, and obedience is achieved through the virtue of the prince, that is, through political prudence. And prudence must be applied to the waging of war, to the control of internal order and external security, and to the regulation of the monetary, agricultural, and commercial economy. So Botero has expanded the reason of the state into the economic terrain, thus opening up to a more advanced reality than does Machiavelli. Botero's purpose of taking political reality into account, of not falling into the vacuous idealization of the just and therefore beloved prince, can be seen throughout The Reason of the State, in which a practical mentality dominates and the interest of the state is taken into account. The doctrine of reason of the state affirms that the security of the state is a requirement of such importance that in order to guarantee it, the rulers of the state are forced to violate the juridical, moral, political, and economic norms which they consider imperative when the security of the state is not threatened. So the thinkers of the 16th century ended up convincing themselves that politics could be reduced to that set of methods, means, and decisions put in place by governments, regardless of laws and moral values. And in the states of the 16th century, the rule that allowed exceptions to law and morality during a state of emergency seems to have become the ordinary practice of government. In the subsequent treaties of the modern age, we can find the same. The problem of morality of politics remains unresolved. For Scipio Admirato, the reason of state derogates from civil law according to a superior interest, the public good, the preservation of the state. In France, in the context of the affirmation of the central power of the state with Henry IV and then with Cardinal Richelieu, political literature was oriented toward political realism. So politics, according Richelieu, reason of the state, responds only to the criterion of state utility. And politics is no longer administered directly and only by the prince, but by the prime minister and his agents. It is the science and practice of an apparatus. So the reason of the state became the science and practice of an entire apparatus. Subsequently, Cardin-Lebray writes, he understood the interest of the state should prevail over all other consideration. The absolutist Europe of the 17th century was about to put aside the ethical problem without solving it. The Italian Machiavellian reason that the writers of the counter-revolution had tried to exercise was evoked in the 17th century by Gabriel Naudet in a publication titled Political Consideration Concerning Coup d'etat. It was a work written in the barbarian Rome, the scene of the maneuvers of the ambassadors of all the Catholic states, a text of provocative frankness in enumerating the crimes committed by government in the name of the interest of the state. Naudet did not even try to judge these crimes from a moral and religious point of view. The effectiveness of political action was the only criterion for judging politics. Thus, over centuries, a double morality has been established in judging the same actions when carried out by the state and when committed by private citizens. It is exactly that double standard condemned without appeal by Mary Rothbard that leads people to consider legitimate acts carried out by the state and its officials, which would be considered crimes if committed by private citizens. So the state, the libertarian insist to apply the same standard of morality to all within society, without any kind of exception, with no exception for individuals or group or the state. The state commits mass murder and calls it war, practice slavery in his army and calls it conscription, practice robbery in order to survive and calls it taxation. The libertarian is the child in the fable, pointing out that the emperor has no clothes. Thus, the state that was born at the dawn of the modern age for the need of pacification to protect people has in reality become, as Rothbard writes, the supreme and eternal and the best organized aggressor against the persons and property of the mass of the public. Thank you.